Alright, the flexbox layout helps to fill the layout void that we've had since the inception of web development. But in the ideal state, the flexbox is really not meant for layout, it is meant for specific use cases like creating your navigation bar and other things. Now, but the grid is more suited for creating your page layout because of its flexibility and above all, its positioning power. Now, with a grid system, you can place any element on any position on your web page. So I am not going to start this tutorial by telling you the advantages of the grid over the flexbox, because the grid is meant for layout and the flexbox is not. So in this video I am going to cover this area, starting with what the CSS grid is, the grid terminology, how the grid layout works, tips on specifying track size values, the grid values, and repeating track sizes. And in my next video I am going to start with defining grid areas. So if you're new here, please consider subscribing for more updates. Alright, the grid module is a two-dimensional layout module that provides a system for laying out your elements in rows and columns. So basically, the grid system divides your page into rows and columns. So when these rows and columns, when they intercept, they tend to create boxes at different positions on your web page. Now in these boxes, that's where you will be putting your elements. By so doing, it gives you this huge positioning power because you can virtually position any element at any position on the web page. So let's say I want to put an element here. Instead of using my flexbox or float or my margin and stuff, all I have to do is place the element directly into this box. Now you can see this makes positioning very easy. Now the grid system is somewhat similar to the flexbox, the basic difference being that the grid gives you control over the rows and columns at the same time, unlike the flexbox, which gives you control over one at a time. So essentially your layout should be a combination of both grid and flexbox, and I'm going to explain that later. So having said that, I'll move to the grid terminology to enable you understand how this grid system works. And if you don't understand the flexbox, you can check my video on flexbox. Now the grid terminology, I am going to start with the grid lines. Now basically the grid is made up of vertical and horizontal lines. You might be asking, what do we need these lines for, since we're just going to place the elements inside the box? Now, when you are placing your elements, there are two methods of doing that. Either you label the lines and use the number to locate the box, or you use the grid area. So now you understand what the grid line is for. Now the next one is the grid track. Now the distance between two adjacent grid lines is called the grid track. Now the distance between two horizontal lines is what creates the rows, and the distance between two vertical lines is what creates the columns. Now next up is the grid cell. Now as these rows and columns intercept, they create a cell. Now the cell is basically the smallest unit of the grid bordered by four adjacent lines. You can see that all the boxes, they have four lines. Now the next one is the grid area, which is basically a combination of two or more grid cells. Alright, next up is the grid container. So essentially you wrap all your grid items within the container. So the first thing I want to do, now this is what I have in my browser. So the first thing I want to do is go to my container and set my display to grid. So when I do this and save and go back to my browser, you will notice that essentially nothing changes. It just stretches it out to fill the entire space. Now next up is the grid template rows and the grid template columns. Now we use this grid template rows and grid template column to determine the number of rows and the number of columns that we want. That's one. Secondly, we also use it to determine the size of each row or each column. So let's say I want a 1FR, 3FR and 1FR. And for the column, let's say I want a 1FR and also a 3FR and a 1FR. Now when I save, what I'm saying is I need 3 rows, 1 2 3, and the size would be, the first one will be 1FR, the second one will be 3FR, and the third will be 1FR. So when I save and go back to my browser, you will notice that I've created 3 rows and 3 columns, and the middle one is 3 times the size of the first and the last one. Now you might be wondering, what is 1FR or what is FR? Now the FR is the fractional unit. You can use other units like the percentage and the pixel. But the problem with the pixel is that it makes your layout less flexible, and the problem with the percentage is when you start using the percentage, you start having problems with the box model properties, most especially the margin and the padding. So it is best to use the fractional unit. And secondly, the fractional unit behaves like your flex grow and flex shrink in flexbox. So essentially, when I go back to this page and try to reduce the size of the page, you will notice that my layout stays the same. You can see the layout is still the same. The middle row is still 3 times the size of the first and the last one. Now this is something you cannot get with the pixel unit. So alright, having said that, next up there's something called the grid column gap and the grid row gap. Let's say I want to put a gap between my columns, and we use this. So when I put say 10 pixels here and save, when I go back to my browser, you will notice that there is a gap between my columns. Let's also say I want to put a gap between my rows, and I give it 10 pixels. When I save and go back, you'll notice that there is a gap between my rows. Now let's say both the gap in the row and the column, you want them to be the same. Instead of doing it this way, you use the grid gap. So I'm going to remove this and I'll put the grid gap. So I'll put a grid gap and I'll set it to 10 pixel. So when I do this, you'll notice that essentially nothing changes. You can see it's still the way it is. Now next up is the repeat. Let's say I want to create 6 columns and I want the first and last to be one fraction, but the middle 4, I want them all to be 2 fractions. Now instead of doing it this way, instead of doing it 1 2 3, instead of doing it this way, we use the repeat. So essentially I'll come here and I'll put my repeat and I'll open up my brackets, and I want 4, so I'll put the number there, and I want each to be 2 fractions. Now when I save and go back, you'll notice I'm going to have 6 columns, and the middle ones will be 2 fractions, while the first and last will be 1 fraction. Now this repeats, you can use it in different forms. Let's say I want everything to be 5 columns with each having the value or the size of 2 fractions. When I save and go back, you'll notice that I have 5 columns and they all have the same value of 2 fractions. So you can use the repeat in different forms and different styles. Now next up is something called dividing the grid area. Now let me take this back to what it was before. I think it was 1FR, 3FR, 1FR. So essentially, let's say this first box, you want to use it for your navigation bar, so you want to stretch it out from here down this way. Now you remember when I talked about the grid lines, this is where we use it. Now there is a way these lines are numbered, so you have to pay attention. Now this one here is 1, this is 2, this is 3, and this is 4. So basically that's how you number that for the columns: 1, 2, 3, 4. Now the rows is still going to be the same. The top will be 1, 2, 3, and 4. So since I'm stretching this out from here to the end, so it's going to start from 1 and it's going to end at 4. So essentially I'll go to my first box here and I'll put my grid column start. So I'm saying it's going to start at 1, and my grid column end, I want it to end at 4. So when I do this and save and go back to my browser, you will notice that this first one was stretched to the end. Let's say the second box, I want the row to move from here down to this place. So like I said before, this is 1, this is 2, this is 3, and this is 4. So I want it to move, it's already in 2, so I want it to move from 2 to 4. So I'll go to my second box and I'll put a grid row start. Let's say grid row start, and I'll set it to 2, and I'll put my grid row end, and I'll set it to 4. Now when I save and go back, you will notice that this one has stretched down to this point. Now yeah, you can see that. Now essentially, instead of using the grid row start and grid row end, there is actually a shortcut. So I'll remove this and I'll remove the start here. So what I have is grid column. Now I want this column to start from line 1, so I'll put my 1, put a forward slash, I want it to stop at 4. Now when I save and go back, you'll notice that it remains the same. Let's say I want it to stop at 3, I could still come here and change this 4 to 3. Now when I save, you'll notice it will not move to the end, it's going to stop somewhere here. So when I save, you can see that's that. So I could also do the same for the rows. Instead of having it this way, I will just use my grid row. Since I'm starting from 2, I'll put my 2 here, put my forward slash, and I'll put the 4. So when I save and go back, essentially you'll see that nothing changes. So that's that for defining the grid areas. So next up, I'll talk about the min max. Alright, in order to explain the min max, I have added some text here, and I've also set all my columns to 300 pixels. Now before I go into the min max, I want to explain something else called the auto. Now basically we use the grid auto rows or the grid auto columns when we want to give all our rows or all our columns a particular value. Now this is what I have in my browser. Let's say I want to give all the rows 150 pixel, or let's just say 100 pixel. Now when I save, you will notice that all the rows will be given a value of 100 pixel. You can see all of them, they've been set to 100 pixel. Now you will also notice that my text, there's an overflow. You can see the text is now under. Now let's say you want to give all your text or your boxes a height of 100 pixels, but yet you want this box with this text to accommodate the text. Now this is where you apply things like the min max. So when I put a min max here, so what I'm basically saying is I want all my box to be 100 pixels, but if I have a box with a content that requires more than 100 pixel, give it the required size irrespective of this value. So when I save and go back to my browser and reload, you'll notice that this box with the text, you can see this row with this text gets enough space to accommodate the text, while the rest they still get the 100 pixels. So that's how what you do with the min max. Now, just like your flexbox, we also have justify items here. Let's say I set my justify item. Now in flexbox we say flex start, flex end, but here you just say start or end. Let's say I set it to end. Now when I save and go back to my browser, when I reload, you notice that they've all moved to the end. I could also move them back to the center by changing my value here to center. Now we also have the, when I save and go back, you will notice that they will be moved to the center. Now we also have the align items, just like your flexbox. So here, when I set my align items and let's say I set it to start, when I save and go back, you will notice that my items will be aligned to the start. You can see they've all been moved to the start. Now we also have the end, the center, and we have the stretch. So usually the default of the align items is the stretch. So when, as you type, the default is stretch. Let me set it to stretch, and you see that it's going to go back to normal as if there was nothing there. So when I go back and reload, you will see it has gone back to what it was before. So the default is stretch. Now alright guys, I'm sort of tired, so I'll continue in my next video. But basically I've covered most of the terms that you need to know in using the grid. I think I left out the grid area. Well, I don't use it that much, so maybe in my next video I will explain that. Alright, thanks guys, and have a lovely day.